Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
You're listening to another episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Bryan, one of the co-hosts, joined with my friend Jim Reske, who just recently taught our men's Bible study on John chapters 11, 12, 13, although he thought he was teaching 14 as well. So
that's right. That's the first lesson, Greg. Check the schedule.
So on this episode, we are going to do the AfterTalk, because I always like to say there's three talks there's three talks really. There's the talk you prepare, the talk you deliver, and then the talk you wish you would have delivered.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
So Jim, as we think about that third talk, like what's on your mind? How are you feeling about everything?
Well, a bunch of things. One is first of all, like tonight, I want to kind of break this up into two things. One is we'll just talk about the talk and some reflections on things that I thought either went well or didn't go well, some things I left out, hits and misses, and then go circle back and look at some of the passages because there was some depth there. But that's the first thing that you just mentioned. The first reflection is, I did all this prep on John on 4 chapters, and it was really only 3. And as a just a word of the wise, check the schedule ahead of time. It was kind of, it's nothing wasted. It's great to study the word and get something.
I thought the way you handled that, like, because you literally did just find out.
Yeah, while I was teaching, like, oh, you're not doing 4 chapters, you're doing 3. Oh, okay, good.
I thought the way you handled that was awesome. It didn't seem to throw you off, but was it throwing you off at all?
No, because actually, I actually only did teach 2. So I didn't even get to the third one, John 13, which is we're going to do in the second half of tonight's After Talk. We'll look at some pieces of John 12 I missed and John 13, and then a few thoughts on John 14 even. We'll do that, the second half here. But no, it was good because, and I think I said this when I was starting, when you go through this, there's so much great stuff here. There's so much great material, so many great thoughts. You want to do 3 things from each chapter. Well, if there's 4 chapters, that's 12 things. You can't do that. You can't, I remember once listening to one of the other teachers talk, and it was a great talk. And I thought afterwards, they talked for it was an hour and 15 minutes, which is our time. And they covered like an outline of the whole section and 2 topics, 2 major like controversies or topics in the passage. And that was about right. That's about right, especially if you want to reflect on it and respond to it. So I wanted to do 2 from 4 chapters, plus this whole history of Calvinism, which was, the other big part of this study we'll talk about a little bit as we reflect on it tonight. That was, in hindsight, it's like throwing a grenade in the middle of the room. Someone later joked, he said, you should save that for like, we got to talk about Leviticus or some passage of the Old Testament that we don't want to spend much time on. Throw a big theological grenade in the room and have everybody just chew on that for a while. Yeah.
Well, thinking of like the idea of hits and misses, I think, I loved when you shared those 5 S's.
Yeah.
And the way you worked that into and even before that, before you shared the 5 S's, you talked about how in each chapter you saw chronology, mm-hmm. responses, teachings, and difficulties.
Yes.
And I thought that was excellent.
It was a way to kind of think about how do you organize. This is, John's kind of organic writing, right? He's writing as inspired by the Holy Spirit, but it doesn't lend itself to a perfect little outline. It probably does. I'm sure lots of theologians have outlined it perfectly over time, right? But I thought there's just these recurring themes. They all show up. They don't show up with the same prominence or same sequence, but they all show up. Like all those chapters have difficulties. All those chapters have a notion of chronology. All those chapters have responses where, someone says something and Jesus responds or vice versa. And so those showed up all the time. And that's why I wanted to introduce them that way. And it gave me a device to kind of you have some consistency through the treatment of the chapters, but not, just, okay, here we go. Now, step one, chronology. Step two, response, and be
Yeah.
just a dry outline.
Did you pick that up from somebody or
No, that was observing it. There are pieces of that from, like, like when Keller's apologetics, when he talks about the idea that a lot of the writings, the gospels, are reportage. They give you historical details. That's how I think we know the scriptures are trustworthy, because he'll say this happened at so and so's house, and they were written at a time where you could go ask them, and they happened in Bethany, happened in this very specific place. It's not in a tale a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's not like a fairy tale, right?
Right. One of the
And
difficulties you mentioned was the fact that the story of Lazarus doesn't say anything.
yeah, that was
There's
that. Now,
there's
that was
no
not in the commentary. That I didn't get that. I was just shocked by that myself. I mean, I didn't. I was looking for that in commentaries. I was reading a ton of commentaries trying to find it, but I didn't see anyone commenting on, like, "Hey, the star of the show doesn't say a word." Didn't anyone notice that?
I thought that was a really good point, and I actually liked your some of the reasons why that is the case. That they were trying to protect him.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, that's when that's the theologians. I did get that. Commentators were saying that's why it doesn't appear in the synoptic gospels. Like, in other words, those may be written while he was still alive. John wrote after he died.
oh yeah, yeah.
That's So that part I did get straight out of a commentary. They're like, because it's another good question. How
Because
can
you would think, why isn't it in all the
Oh,
Transfiguration is in all four? I believe it's in all four. There's several stories that are in all four gospels.
but raising someone from the dead is a big story.
Yeah,
You just think, like, it's a good skeptic question. Why isn't it in the other ones then? Right.
right. But
Uh,
then you transition to how the gospels and all those
mhm, mhm.
parts of the gospel, and then you talked about the five S's of the gospel and how you know I thought that was excellent.
Well, and actually, I thought afterwards, Greg, I get a lot of responses, and I got some about the Calvinism topic. People come afterwards and want to wrestle with it, and which is fine. But I got more responses afterwards, and some emails afterwards saying, "Hey, those five S's, what were those again? And send me that slide,
Yeah,
or send me any background material you have on that." And I think that was so. I'm really happy about that, because that, you can get mired in a controversy, right? Endless speculation over controversies. There's a verse that warns us about doing that, and but the five S's are the gospel. And let's start there, if you don't mind, because I had some thoughts on that when I was going through them. I
sure,
did. I didn't want to belabor them too much, because I've mentioned one of these S's in almost every talk I've ever given. And if you, for anyone listening to this podcast who didn't catch the last one, so they are substitution. Jesus took my place. Standing. The Christian doctrine is, in his eyes, I am 100% complete. That's my standing before him, given to me as a gift because of Jesus taking my place. Scale, that the gap between me and him is far greater than I think it is. My sin is far worse than I realize, and his holiness is far greater than I think. Sequence, it is, I obey, therefore I am accepted, not I am accepted, therefore I obey.
yeah,
And then surrender. There is something I do. I choose to put my trust, a trust transfer. I stop trusting things I was trusting for my justification. I start trusting in him. So people, I'm so glad I got a couple people saying, "Hey, send me those again," because that's the essence. But one of the things I thought about saying, Greg, that I had in my notes that I didn't say, I said, if you ever hear a good sermon, you're going to say, you say, that was so gospel driven. What is it? Without even using one of these words that start with the letter S, it's always one of these things. All the Keller sermons that I just adore from Tim Keller, I think they're so phenomenal. They always come back to the gospel. They'll always touch on one of these things. But the part to make a really strong point about it, I was going to say, I pulled back from saying it, was that if you don't hear one of these things, it's a lousy sermon. It's not, or it's a lousy book or article. And if you hear these things, then you say, that's really gospel driven. It's great. But if you don't, it's bad, and it's bad because it's not good news. It ends up being good advice. And you and I talked about this, Greg. How many times you hear a sermon and someone's reading the Bible and they say, "Hey, now here's 5 things you got to do to follow Jesus. Here's 4 things you got to do." And if you understand the gospel, you say, "Look, those things don't justify me. They don't get me any closer to him. My standing is already complete. You understand the S's.
Right.
My sequence is I'm accepted already there. I want to obey. You get all that right. Now you give me those 5 things to do. I want to do them. They don't add to my standing. They don't add to my justification. In other words, if you miss the S's and just, so much Christian writing and thought, it ends up in at least in our Protestant world, ends up being good advice. And it's stuff like the article I told you about, I read a long time ago, and I don't want to name the publication because it's really gospel driven. And it was talking about the gap between you and God. And I got so excited because I thought about the illustration we always talk about, this growing lines that divide your awareness of your sin and your awareness of his holiness, how the cross fills the gap. And I said, this is going to be great. He's talking about the gap. It's getting wider and wider. I thought it was great. And then he said, now, 3 things you need to do to fill that gap.
Oh,
no,
wow.
no. You just killed it. Now you're teaching good advice, self-sanctification. You've got to, work harder and close the gap. And just lost it.
It's all too common.
All too common,
sadly.
Right. It's, justification by grace, but sanctification through hard work and effort, not sanctification by grace. So anyway, that's maybe a little strong. It's great for this podcast. I didn't want to kind of pull back from saying that live in the room,
I think you could have said it and it would have been fine. But, there
was enough controversy to go around. So.
I'm just glad you brought, you mentioned the gospel, the way you brought it in. Was there any other hits and misses that you think of?
Well, so then I guess a couple things. And I started talking, this thing was a history of Calvinism, and I was really trying to keep, and I think for the most part,
you did a great job introducing that and trying to diffuse the controversy.
Right. So we did a lot of,
you were stepping into a controversial.
Well, yeah. And so sometimes, here's the thing we say, and as part of this Bible study in particular, and the way we like to hear the word preached as we live our Christian lives, not to shy away from some of these things, right? So controversies are difficult passages. And that was what I was getting to when I say there's difficulties in every one of these chapters. My wife is teaching English as a second language, and there's some people there that they're complete non-believers from different cultures. And which it's at a church, it's a volunteer position. So she uses, we're gonna study English, and the reading today is a short passage from the Bible, which is, everyone knows that's what they're doing. So there's no one surprised by that. It's all fine.
Yeah.
And but then you have people from different cultures reading the Bible cold for the first time, and they read things and they're like, what? It says what? God had a flood and killed everybody. They drowned everybody. What is that? What God did? The angel of death comes and kills everybody that doesn't have blood on the door? Is that really? And you realize, with someone with fresh eyes reading it cold, stuff that you and I read, and we just kind of, it's really difficult. It's hard to take, and that's why this passage has this thing where he's talking about the Jewish people, and he says God hardened their hearts, and there's lots of theology behind that, but it brings up this whole topic, and you can just scan over it and say, let's choose not to talk about it. But I think in this study, part of what we do is we plow through and you tackle the difficult things once in a while. So, but I didn't want to get into an argument, and I was trying to set up to say, let's not get into substance. And for the most part, the guys did that. There's, we waded into those waters a little bit, but for the most part, stuck with just the history.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wish you would have said that you didn't say?
A couple things. There was one thing, I was talking about Augustine and how he developed this argument with Pelagius, and how he, took this position where, and I said this, what happens in human argument is, you take a position, then I take a position, and so you battle for yours, and I keep battling mine, and we push each other a little farther away. It's human nature, and what about this? And we get a little more extreme than when we started. And I mentioned that Augustine did that, but I didn't give why that was so, because Augustine, he took this position that, with Pelagius saying, you're the first mover. You can reach out to God, and you can get to God on your own if you just make all the right choices and live a holy life. Augustine says that's absolutely not true. And then he said, in fact, you don't do anything. You're completely passive. God predestines you individually. And that's the part where the church said we reject Pelagius completely, and we embrace Augustine mostly, but not that last bit about the particular individual predestination. But and as I made that, what I left out, I had my notes, but I just left it out, was we kind of know that's what happened with Augustine because his earlier writings are different than his later writings on this topic. In his earlier writings, he had more of the church view that was common at the time that, yes, when the Bible talks about words like predestination, and the words that anyone in this podcast that's in the Calvinist tradition completely embrace is talking about particular individual predestination of the elect only. The church at that time, Augustine, when he was younger, thought and understood those verses to talk about God's foreknowledge. So when and not not God's 100% causality. So
So you're saying he changed his view?
He did. So he talked about like, yeah, God knows who's going to choose him. So in that sense, that's what predestined means. But then later he said, no, what it means is you're 100% passive. You don't do anything. God chooses you. And that's the part that the Council of Orange or the Synod of Orange said, no, you still have to make a choice, a free will decision. But the part that gloriously they did come to, which is very significant, is that God is the first mover, that you can't do anything on your own. And that actually, I don't know if you noticed, but in yesterday's Bible study, that came up again as a question. Someone asked that again, like, how exactly does it work? Like, do you move or does God move? It's this very question that we talked about that the Council of Orange is trying to settle, to say, you need God's grace to respond or do anything. You can't do anything on your own. You can't, you need prevenient grace. You need, if it weren't for him enabling it, you couldn't, you're dead at the bottom of the ocean. You can't do anything. So, anyway, so that was one that historical development in Augustine's thinking. I had it in my notes and forgot to bring it up. Yeah, and so and then other examples about that bring up that kind of related to what I was just saying about what Augustine says, you don't do anything. The church saying, no, you do something, you do respond. It's and I hinted at this in the talk. It's when Jesus says, Lazarus come out, Lazarus comes out. When Jesus says to the little girl that he heals, Jairus' daughter, Talitha cum, he says something and she wakes up. She responds. Now, does she get any credit for rising herself from the dead? Would Lazarus take off his wrapping and say, I raised myself from the dead? I'm pretty good. I can't believe I just did that. And then, no, of course not. Lazarus would fall at Jesus' feet and worship him and thank him, right? So he doesn't get any credit, but he still had to come forth. Jesus doesn't levitate him out. Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. And I think Bonhoeffer wrote about this other example. The notion that of you do something, you're not 100% passive the way Augustine was arguing. You do something, you don't get any credit for it. But he said, Peter says, Lord, if it's really you, ask me to come out in the water and I'll come out in the water and walk to you. And Jesus says, come out.
Right.
And so there's a moment where Peter had to lift one leg over the railing of a boat and set it on the water and put weight on it.
Right.
And would Peter say, I made myself walk in the water? I look at give himself credit? Of course not.
Yeah.
He says, all spiritual, Jack. This is Jesus doing it. But he had to do something. He lifted one leg over the railing of the boat and stepped out, right? And that's what I was trying to capture with the word surrender. So,
yeah.
Anyway, that was something I so a couple points that I left out. And then the Q&A after, as we're talking about it, there was a moment where I left this part out too. Someone was getting into the substance of it and talking about how all these verses that seem to talk about particular individual predestination. So they all relate to the sovereignty of God. And I don't know if you listen to it, there's a moment when I kind of said, yeah, I made a little levity of it, a little joke where I say people on both sides like to say, well, I have a very high view of Scripture.
Right.
And, me too, so, as it turns out. And so, and people, but when I said, yeah, no, I was almost going to take the bait and respond substantively to what he was saying. And I didn't. So let me do it now if I could, because what he said was, he was talking about, at that moment, the questioner was talking about the sovereignty of God. And when I have these conversations, the Calvinist conversations, people talk about this. What about, well, What about the sovereignty of God? I mean, someone you remain nameless, but someone you and I both know who is really strong on Calvinism. And let's talk about the other verses that don't seem to say that. And you just say, well, I just can't get around the sovereignty of God. That just settles the matter for me. And that's was his primary paradigm and perspective. I just can't get around the sovereignty of God. And the response is that I didn't say Saturday that I was tempted to say was, well, what if God in his sovereignty creates a system where individuals have agency? Individuals within that system have free choice. In other words, God in his sovereignty sets up the whole thing. It says the way I choose to set it up in my sovereignty is that you can choose. Right. So, in other words, it's a way to reconcile the idea like, yeah, God is sovereign. Well, then how does anyone have free will? Because God designed it, he designed it to have free will. So if you believe in free will, that's kind of how you, a little bit how you reconcile those. And there's another part of this that I actually once talked about at your Kent State ministry, Greg, in a talk I gave. Do you remember when I showed a clip from the end of the, what movie was that? The Matrix.
Oh,
do you remember that one?
Yeah.
They showed a clip at the end of the Matrix, and I'll make this really short, but it's a great clip where, these movies have been out for about 25 years, so no spoiler alerts. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the Matrix. If you haven't, you should go see it. But one of the big questions in the Matrix is this philosophical question: is there free will, or is everything determined?
Right.
And the architect of the Matrix says everything is determined. I mean, I'll give you a choice. You could save your girlfriend or let people die, but I already know what you're going to do. I know what you're going to do. And, I know all your motivations. I know everything you want to do. And the reason I bring that up is I remember a conversation with a very strong Calvinist once, and he was talking. He says, look, you can say you chose salvation, but if you're dying in the desert of starvation and someone sets a steak dinner in front of you, what are you going to do? And it's a way to say your choice is a fallacy. It only looks like choice, right? You're dying of starvation. I already know what you're going to do. And the beauty of that little thing in the Matrix, the movie, is that the end, there's a scene at the very end where the hero, his name is Neo, is fighting the antagonist, and who's a part of the Matrix that's replicating, I forget his name, but Agent Smith. Agent Smith.
Yeah.
And they're fighting. There's no resolution. They keep fighting, and they realize that we're just going to fight for eternity because neither of us can win. We're just going to keep fighting. And there's a scene, you remember this, where Mr. Smith takes his glasses off and he says, I don't get it. I don't get it. Why do you do it?
Yeah.
Why do you do it? Your girlfriend's already dead. Do you do it for love? Do you do it for posterity? Do you do it for money? Why do you keep fighting me? And it's a great moment because it gave me theological insight watching the movie, the secular history, because what Neo says, do you remember what he says?
I forget what he says.
He says, because I choose to.
Oh.
I just choose to. In other words, you think you know exactly what I'm doing, all my motivations, that you can predict exactly what I'm going to do because you know what, I'm just choosing it. I just pure choice. And the theology of this is that when God chooses the nation of Israel, and this is back to my wife's class, one of her students had a terrible time with this. Why does God choose one nation? How can God choose one nation out of all the nations? How fair is that? What is God doing? He just chooses it. He says, I just choose this one nation. They haven't done anything to deserve it. I just choose them. It's the contrast of Noah versus Abraham. Noah was the one righteous man with a flood. Abraham is a complete pagan. God just chooses Abraham not for anything Abraham's done. And when God chooses a path of salvation to the Gentiles for us to become grafted in, right? And God says, I'm going to do this. When God, there's nothing you and I have done,
right,
to merit it whatsoever. Why is it? Pure choice. So what does God then? This is the beauty. This is the symmetry of it. What does God want back from us? Does God say, well, and you taught me this, Greg, because you're saying, remember that when you said, if heaven was like, a wonderful, huge mansion on the waterfront that was, gorgeous in every way, but Jesus wasn't there, would you want it? It's a good thought-provoking question,
Yeah.
And the part of the theology of it that helped me was like thinking like, okay, would you choose, if there's no reward for you in heaven, there's no mansion for you, there's no reward for you, something like that, would you choose it anyway? And I think what God is saying, I know you usually don't. a lot of times you choose because you don't want to go to hell, you want to go to heaven. And you're trying to be good because you want rewards in heaven, you want good things, right? But what God wants for us is what he gave to us, which is pure choice, where I say, Lord, I just want you. I just want you, Jesus. I don't want you because Jesus, you get me into heaven. I don't want you, you give me a good life. You bless me. I'm not using you instrumentally to get to something else. I just want you for you, full stop. Pure choice, right? So what God, and that for me, that explains a lot theologically. What God is offering, what God does is pure choice. What he offers is what he wants back from us is pure choice. Anyway, and I think, by the way, now that having said all that, you might be able to have embrace that little story I just told as either Calvinist or Arminian, either way. That's a beautiful story, but it supports either position. So,
right.
Anyway, so anyway, those are some thoughts. The Matrix thing I had not planned on getting into. We're getting into it now because we have a little extra time in the podcast to kind of just chat. But that would have been way too big of a rabbit hole to go down on a Saturday morning. Anyway, there was another point just in the Q&A afterwards. I want to reflect on, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Where someone wanted to get into the substance, so wanted to get into the, go back to the passage, let's read that together. And they had a strong view on what that passage meant. And the part I thought about later, I didn't think of at the time, Greg, only later, was, if you have your tradition, your paradigm, whether it's Calvinist, Arminian, or whatever it is, semi-Pelagius, you look at that passage through that lens and you read it that way. And just read it again. It's so plain on its face what it says. The question is, okay, I understand you read it that way, but do you understand there are well-meaning Christians, true believers, who have read it the exact opposite way? It's not like they carved that passage out. It's not like they don't know it's there.
Right.
And it's true for almost all our theological positions. You say, okay, I believe in this view of such and such. The people that disagree with me, that I quote a passage that supports my point of view, they know that passage is there too. They're reading it differently than I am. And part of what I think I would like to be able to do better is to say, put myself in their shoes and say, how do you read it? Now, I had this conversation with someone right after the talk. They came up, we were chatting about this idea, and the idea I mentioned at the time that came to mind is that Christianity is like a tabletop. And I think that within that tabletop, we have all kinds of different traditions and views, but primarily we are all still saying, when there's a question like this, we're looking at Scripture to understand it. In other words, I look at this verse one way, you look at the verse the other way. I could do well to say, Greg, how do you read that? And learn from it, learn from you, right? You read it, some verse, totally opposite of the way I read it. I never thought of it that way. Let's read it together. And we do a little of that in this podcast. But I think when you fall off the edge of Christianity, you're saying, who knows if the Bible is true or not? You don't think of the Bible as authoritative. Let's look at other sources of truth. I feel like when you start saying, that's nice, the Bible says that, but I don't really have to believe that anyway. I believe this other thing over here, and that's my real guidepost, my real source of truth. Well, then you're kind of saying my source of authority is not divine revelation from what God said. It's something else. My culture, the predisposed dispositions, my beliefs, whatever. And I feel like that's when you're kind of walking off the edge of the table. If I'm dealing with someone who's still on the table and he's saying, I disagree, Jim, completely. You've read it all wrong. All these, you don't know what you're talking about. At least we're both looking at the Bible together, right?
Right.
So we're still on the table. We're arguing, but we're still on the table, and there's commonality there. But both of us agreeing that the Scripture is authoritative. Anyway, I'm not sure every theologian would agree on my tabletop analogy. That's kind of the way I see it.
Well, so do you think Pelagius is in heaven?
Oh gosh, wow, that's a great one. I'm glad no one asked me that put me on the spot.
Is he at the table? Is he?
Well, so at the end, if you listen to the end of the tape, one of the people said, "What about the semi-Pelagians?" And like that's that's like 50% of Christianity, thinking like they're saying Jesus plus.
Right.
Um, and by the way, here's another another thing I wish I could do differently. As I'm speaking, I realize we're going to take this audio and put it on the podcast. I had a visual on the screen trying to say, what do I do? And what does God do in salvation? And so,
Yeah.
God's at the top, we're down here. And so in the Pelagian view, you just have a yellow arrow pointing, going from the bottom up
Yeah.
with just a solid arrow. And that visual, I could have just done a better job with some words to describe it for the audio only take later. With Augustinian, it's a blue arrow, just comes straight down. So God does everything. God reaches down to you. And then the I can pull it up. I'm doing it by memory, but the semi-Pelagian view, which is close to Pelagianism, is where basically you're reaching up to God. The yellow line starts reaching up to God, and then God, a dotted blue line, reaches back down to you. That's the God helps those who help themselves view. But
Did I just put it on the screen for you?
I lost you. Yes, that's it. Thanks for doing that. Again, but we're on the sharing screen, but our own podcast is not going to see it. So
Right.
it's got to describe it a little bit. It's a nice visual. I think so. That semi-Pelagianism was a lot of what the Roman Catholic Church had drifted into pre-Reformation, and I got to be careful here because I'm not Catholic, and so I think like 50% of the world, 50% of Christianity is Catholic. Like 40% is Protestant and 10% is Eastern Orthodox. So if the Roman Catholic Church is semi-Pelagian, then if you say, well, they're saying Jesus plus, they don't get it. They're not Christians. Like, wow, that's a lot of Christianity. You just said is not going.
Right.
I don't know if I feel that. I feel like I have differences with them theologically on things, right?
See, I think that's where we get into, and you brought this up, we're all essentially like the thief on the cross. How much theology do we really need to know
I don't know.
to get
I
us
don't know.
there?
I'm trusting thee, Lord Jesus, trusting only if you just say, Lord, I believe, that's it. Help me in my unbelief.
So I think that I think that, God knows our hearts and he knows. I think there's going to be a lot of believers that there's going to be a lot of people there that maybe we weren't expecting to see there.
Yeah.
There might be people that we were expecting to see there that
I don't know.
Who knows, but
I hope it doesn't have to be super accurate because I'm sure my theology is off somewhere, right?
Well, that's the thing, and that's we talk about that all the time. None of us have perfect theology. Calvin never started, he never set out to start something. I mean, he might be just mad at the word Calvinism,
right?
that something was named a theological way of viewing the scriptures was named after him.
And I think Luther didn't want Lutheranism to be that way either. I think a lot of people are like that. Luther wanted to reform the Catholic Church, not start something new.
Right.
You know, so yeah, and I think I saw there's like 180 is a Pew Research thing, PEW. That there's 180 Protestant denominations. So there's lots of different estimates of that number. Some estimates are like in the thousands. I don't think that seems too much.
Man.
But 180 is probably right. And they all think they're right. Right.
Yeah.
And one of them probably is, or one of them may be. But if
I don't know. I wonder if any of them are right.
Well, but so let's say one of them nailed it, and God says, "Congratulations, you're the only one. You cracked the code. You figured it out. Everybody else missed it, but you." It's if they did, it's a gift anyway. It's because God led them that way. It's like it's a total gift. So
right. Yeah.
But I don't know. I hope. Yeah, I just hope it's a big tent, Greg.
I think it has to be. It has to be. I mean, just thinking of the Bible as a whole,
right?
And God's plan for redemption. That it was he wants everyone. His desires for everyone to come to know him.
Yeah. And you think about salvation in the Old Testament, how they were all saved by looking forward to a Messiah. The atoning blood of a Messiah would come, but it was not a very clear theology. right?
Sure.
Didn't understand the Trinity or the hypostatic union.
Correct.
Like,
okay, so do you want to transition to
well, let me just say one more thing about this. I do want to transition some of these passages, but just one more thing about Augustine and Pelagianism, because you and I talked about this before, but in that study I gave, like, in 20 minutes, this little thing on history, and I hope I got all the history right. I mean, I'm really happy to be corrected on the history if I missed something, especially when I stray and start talking about, like, the role of Peter Lombard and in the Catholic Church, because that's not my tradition. So I'm always tentative whenever I wade in waters that I'm enough, it's not that I'm not always that familiar with. But the thing about Pelagianism that I really reflect on, you and I talk about, is when he talked about, you can be saved through all your hard work and effort. It's the infiltration of that Pelagianism into your sanctification. It's the what you and I think a big part of the reason behind this podcast, falling in love with Jesus, being gospel addicts, is understanding grace as being operative for our sanctification as well. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.